You wake up in the middle of the night and the room is cold, so you reach over, tap a screen, and go back to sleep. Somewhere in a wall, a machine hears you and starts pushing heat into the air around your body. You never see it work. You never even really think about it. It just happens the same way it happened last night and the night before that, stretching back to whenever the thermostat was installed and you stopped noticing it was there at all. Now take that away. All of it. No wall, no machine, no flick of a switch. You're a body standing in the open, in a winter that doesn't know or care whether you survive it, with nothing between you and the cold except what you can make with your own hands. That was the actual condition of every human who ever lived before a tiny number of very recent generations. And somehow, across hundreds of thousands of years, in places that dropped to temperatures that would kill you in a night, people didn't just survive. They had children, raised them, grew old. So the question isn't really whether ancient humans could survive winter without heating. They obviously could, because you're here. The real question is what they built instead, and it turns out the answer is more impressive than the thermostat. Start with fire, because fire is the part everyone assumes they already understand. You picture a campfire, something warm and orange, people huddled around it in a movie about cavemen. That image isn't wrong exactly, but it undersells what fire actually was. Fire wasn't a comfort item. It was closer to a piece of infrastructure, the first one humans ever built. And it changed almost everything about how a body could survive a cold night. The anthropologist Richard Wrangham has spent decades studying what fire did to human evolution, and his argument is that controlled fire didn't just keep people warm, it restructured human biology itself. Cooking food with fire made calories easier to extract, which freed up energy that used to go toward digestion and let it go toward a bigger brain instead. But set the cooking argument aside for a second and just think about what a fire does on a freezing night. It's a heat source you can carry the idea of anywhere, rebuild from nothing but wood and a spark, and place exactly where you need it. A modern heating system is fixed in your walls. A fire is portable knowledge. Once you have it, you can make more of it wherever you go, for as long as fuel exists. That's not a small consolation prize compared to central heating. In a lot of ways, it's more resilient than central heating because it doesn't depend on a grid, a bill, or someone else's infrastructure. It depends on you knowing how to do it. And people built their lives around that fact. Archaeological sites across Ice Age Europe and Asia show hearths at the center of living spaces. Again and again, not incidental campfires, but deliberately maintained, returned to, cared for fires that anchored where people slept, cooked, and gathered. The hearth was the emotional and physical center of a camp, the same way a heating vent is invisible infrastructure in your home today. Except everyone in that camp knew exactly how it worked, because keeping it alive was often literally their job. But fire alone doesn't explain how humans spread into places that get punishingly cold, because you can't sit in a fire's heat all night while you're out tracking an animal, gathering food, or just moving from one place to another. For that, you needed something you could wear. And this is where the story gets stranger than you'd expect, because clothing, real fitted clothing, is a surprisingly late invention. The archaeologist Ian Gilligan has built much of his career around this exact puzzle, and his research makes a case that clothing wasn't just a byproduct of human intelligence showing up early, and obviously, it was a specific technological response to cold, one that shows up in the archaeological and biological record at a real, traceable moment, not from the very beginning of the human story. For a long stretch of time, humans in warmer regions simply didn't need it, and the evidence suggests they didn't have it. So how do you even date the invention of clothing, something made of animal skin and plant fiber that mostly rots away and leaves nothing behind for archaeologists to dig up? The answer involves an organism you'd probably rather not think about: lice. Human head lice have been with us essentially forever, adapted to live in hair, but there's a second species, body lice, that lives specifically in clothing, feeding on skin but nesting in fabric. Body lice couldn't have evolved until there was clothing to live in. So if you can figure out when body lice split off genetically from head lice, you get a rough biological clock for when clothing itself came into use. That's exactly what a team led by the geneticist Mark Stoneking did in a study with his colleagues Kittler and Kaiser, published in the journal Current Biology. By comparing the DNA of the two louse species, they estimated the split happened somewhere in the range of 70,000 to as much as 170,000 years ago, depending on the methods and data used in later refinements of the study. Anatomically modern humans, meanwhile, had already existed for well over 100,000 years before that window even opens. In other words, our species spent an enormous stretch of its early existence without tailored, fitted clothing at all, relying on nothing but skin, fire, shelter, and behavior to handle the cold. Now, no clothing doesn't mean nothing was worn. Draped hides, wrapped skins, and simple coverings almost certainly came earlier and left no genetic trace the way fitted, sewn clothing did. Gilligan's broader argument is that there's a real difference between a hide thrown over the shoulders and true tailored clothing, sewn and shaped to trap warm air against the body, and that the second kind of technology tracks closely with the depth of the cold humans we're actually facing. As the Ice Age deepened and modern humans pushed into genuinely brutal environments, the clothing had to become genuinely sophisticated to match, evolving from a simple wrap into something closer to what you'd recognize as a coat. And once you look at what that sophistication actually meant, it's remarkable how modern feeling it is. Excavations from sites associated with the Upper Paleolithic period, including toolkits containing eyed needles and bone awls, show people were sewing multiple layers of tailored hide together, not just draping a single skin over their shoulders. That's a fitted, layered system, built the same way outdoor gear works today. A base layer against the skin, an insulating layer to trap warm air, and an outer layer to block wind and moisture. They didn't have the vocabulary for base layer and shell, but they'd arrived at the same engineering answer through trial, error, and the simple brutal feedback of a body that either stayed warm enough or didn't. Clothing and fire cover the outside of the body. But there's a third piece of the puzzle that isn't a piece of technology at all. It's the body itself. And it turns out that some ancient humans weren't just protecting themselves from the cold with tools. Their actual physical shape carried adaptations to it. This is where Neanderthals come into the story. The paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkhaus spent much of his career studying Neanderthal skeletons. And one of the patterns he identified is that Neanderthal body proportions line up strikingly well with two long-standing biological principles called Bergmann's rule and Allen's rule. Broadly, these rules describe a pattern seen across many mammal species. Populations living in colder climates tend to have bulkier bodies and shorter limbs relative to their trunk, which reduces the amount of surface area exposed to cold air per unit of body mass, while populations in warmer climates tend to be leaner and longer-limbed, which helps the body shed heat instead of trap it. Neanderthal skeletons, with their notably shorter forearms and shins relative to their upper arms and thighs, and their generally stocky, robust build, fit this cold-adapted pattern closely. Their bodies weren't just surviving the Ice Age. In a very real physical sense, their bodies were built by it, shaped by many thousands of years of selection in environments where retaining body heat was a constant life or death pressure. Modern humans carry a much fainter version of this same pattern. Populations with long histories in colder regions tend, on average, to show proportionally shorter limbs than populations with long histories nearer the equator, echoing the same underlying logic just without the extremity Neanderthals show. It's a reminder that surviving winter wasn't only a matter of what people carried or built. Over deep enough time, it left a mark on the very shape of the human body. None of this, though, quite explains one of the simplest and most effective cold weather strategies humans have ever used, and it costs nothing, requires no tools, and works immediately. Sleeping close together. A human body radiates a surprising amount of heat all night long. Heat that, alone in the open, just drifts off and disappears into the cold air around you, but put several bodies close together, under a shared covering, in a shelter that traps that radiating warmth instead of letting it escape. And you've built a heating system out of nothing but the people who need it. It's the oldest space heater there is, and it never needed a power source, because the power source was each other. This connects to something the historian A. Roger Kirch has documented about how humans slept before modern lighting and heating reshaped the night. Sleep wasn't the solitary, sealed-off, single-room event it often is now. Across long stretches of human history, sleeping arrangements tended to be communal, bodies close together in a shared space, in part because it made practical sense in a world where the alternative was losing precious body heat to the cold night air alone. Combine that instinct with a well-built shelter, ideally something dug into the ground or into a snowbank, both of which are surprisingly excellent insulators, and you get a survival strategy that layers fire, clothing, architecture, and sheer proximity to other people into one system, each part covering for the weaknesses of the others. And the shelters themselves could get remarkably ambitious. In parts of Ice Age Ukraine and Russia, archaeologists have found the remains of dwellings built almost entirely from mammoth bones, dozens of them, arranged into a dome-like structure and likely covered with hides. Building something like that wasn't a 5-minute task. It meant planning, cooperation, and almost certainly returning to the same site across multiple seasons, hauling enormous bones into position, engineering a structure that could hold up against wind and snow load through an entire winter. This wasn't improvised survival, it was architecture, built by people who understood exactly what kind of enclosed, insulated space they needed to make it through the cold months, and who were willing to do serious, coordinated work to get it. There's one more piece to this, and it's easy to miss because it isn't a tool you can hold or a structure you can point to. It's fuel in the most literal sense. What you actually eat determines how much heat your own body can generate in the first place. All the fire, clothing, and shelter in the world only buys you so much if the furnace inside you isn't burning hot enough to begin with. And that furnace runs on calories, specifically the kind that are hardest to find in a cold environment. The anthropologist John Speth, who has spent decades studying the diets of Paleolithic and historic hunting peoples, has documented a strange and very specific danger that shows up again and again in cold climate hunting societies: eating too much lean meat and not enough fat. The human body can only process roughly a few hundred grams of protein a day before the liver simply can't keep up with breaking it down. And pushing past that limit for even a week or two brings on a debilitating, sometimes fatal condition that researchers and early trappers both came to call rabbit starvation, named for exactly the kind of lean, fat-poor meat that triggers it. Wild game in winter is often lean like that, its own fat reserves burned down by the same cold that's testing the humans hunting it. So a hunter in that position isn't just chasing calories in general, they're chasing fat specifically. And Speth's research shows this shaped hunting behavior directly, going after the fattiest animals available, favoring fat-rich cuts like marrow and organ meat over lean muscle, sometimes discarding large amounts of lean meat entirely, rather than risk overloading on protein, because the fat wasn't optional seasoning. It was the fuel that kept the internal fire burning through a season when everything external was trying to put it out. That reframes the whole picture in a useful way. A body in deep cold is running its own kind of furnace non-stop just to hold its core temperature steady, and that furnace has to be fed correctly, or none of the external systems matter as much as they should. Fire, clothing, and shelter manage heat loss from the outside. Diet manages heat production from the inside. Ancient winter survival wasn't only about keeping the cold out. It was equally about keeping the internal engine properly stocked with exactly the kind of calories that engine needed most, and people tracked that need closely enough to reshape which animals they hunted and which parts of the carcass they bothered carrying home. Step back and look at the whole picture together, and what stands out isn't any single invention. It's how many separate systems had to work at once, each one covering for what the others couldn't do alone. Fire gave you concentrated, on-demand heat, but only where you built it, and only as long as you tended it. Clothing gave you portable insulation that moved with you through the day, but by itself, it couldn't fully replace a heat source on the coldest nights. Shelter gave you a space that trapped warmth instead of losing it to open air, but an empty shelter is just a cold box. And other people sleeping close, sharing that space, gave you a heat source that needed no fuel and never ran out as long as everyone stayed close enough to share it. No one of these things was enough by itself. Together, layered and combined, they added up to something that could carry a human body through a winter that on its own that body had absolutely no business surviving. It's worth sitting with how different that is from what you rely on today. Your heating system is one thing, a furnace, a heat pump, a grid delivering power from somewhere you'll probably never see. If it breaks or the power goes out, you're suddenly much closer to that same naked vulnerability every ancient human faced every single winter of their lives, except without any of the layered, redundant systems they'd built to answer it. They didn't have one solution. They had four, running at the same time, reinforcing each other, none of them dependent on a company, or a wire, or a bill arriving on time. So the next time you tap that screen on the wall and warm air starts moving through your house without you lifting another finger, it's worth remembering what that convenience replaced. Not primitive discomfort, a genuinely sophisticated, tested by survival system of fire, clothing, shelter, and each other, built by people who had absolutely no backup plan if it failed, and who built it anyway, well enough that their descendants are still here, cranking a thermostat thousands of generations later, mostly forgetting it was ever any other way.